My name is Piyush Chaudhary, Assistant Professor at Hansraj College, University of Delhi. In the first part, I gave a brief introduction to the story The Curter, and I also discussed the summary of the entire story. I discussed 11 sections, part by part in detail in the first part, and now in the second part, in this video currently, I will discuss certain important themes of the story. So first I will show you my lesson plan for this lecture, and as you can see on the screen, this is the lecture plan. The first will be on the relationship between Certainly Mary and Mixed Up Porter. So I'll discuss the character analysis in this part. Then the second will be Rushdie's sense of in-betweenness and his hybrid self. It's a very important element of Rushdie's fiction, and I'll be discussing that as well. And the third will be Rushdie's experiments with the English language. So any discussion on Rushdie will definitely include the last two parts that I just now showed you. So let me now go on to the first section of the lecture today, and that is on the relationship between Certainly Mary and Mixed Up Porter. So this section will include a character analysis of both these characters. So the relationship between these two characters is more or less, it's platonic. It's there is nothing sexual or overtly romantic between them, because Mary knows that she is well past the oddities of sexual attraction, and now she is more than 60 years old, and therefore the idea of a romantic sexual love simply does not exist, right? So for both these characters, the support that they have for each other, the feeling of belongingness that they get with each other is of prime importance, right, for both Certainly Mary and Mixed Up Porter. Living as immigrants in a foreign land, coming from some other country, they face discrimination, and now with each other they feel a sense of belonging. So he gets a new lease of life, even Mixed Up Porter gets a new lease of life. Very recently he suffered from stroke, and now his brain power is also deteriorating, right? On the other hand, for Mary, despite her old age, despite her weaknesses, she is a very fast learner. She learns chess very fast from the tricks of the famous chess grandmaster, that is Messire, the Mixed Up Porter, right? Also the Porter himself is, as I told you in the previous lecture also I discussed in the first part, he was not a British man. So it can be observed that throughout this story, any amount of intimacy can only be witnessed between characters who are themselves immigrants in England. If you look at the character of Rosalia and the unnamed narrator, they had a brief sexual encounter in the first part of the lecture. I discussed that, right? And Rosalia was also a Polish girl. She was from Poland. She was not from England, right? And then similarly, Mixed Up Porter is also from some obscure, unknown, East European roots, right? And Certainly Mary, of course, we know, the Aya, the household maid, Mary, she is from Bombay, India, right? So any amount of intimacy can be witnessed between characters who are themselves immigrants in England, just like Mary, and Mixed Up Porter. So therefore the story shows a world where meaningful relationships are not made between the expatriates and the natives, right? So meaningful relationships are not formed between the native English people and the immigrants. So Salman Rushdie is basically showing the inability of cross-cultural encounters ending in meaningful relationships. It is like mixing oil with water, and at the end of the mixture it will leave both these elements in an unmixed state, right? So this is the reason why the immigrant experience is an important theme in this story. So the story of this couple is important also because in the initial pages of the story, the narrator mentions, in the second section, he mentions that it is not just a story of the couple, but of all who are living as immigrants in a foreign land, right? So the older generation, that is the generation of Mary and Mixed Up Porter, they find peace in a foreign land, and therefore one of the characters goes back to her native country, India, and that is Certainly Mary. She goes back to Bombay, and the other characters simply disappear. After the attack on Messire, they simply disappear. The other person, Mixed Up Porter, he is nowhere to be found, right? So his whereabouts are not known. We do not know whether actually at the end of section 11, in the end of the story, he goes to meet the man Mixed Up Porter, but then he has left, and there is some other person who is working as a porter in section 11 right at the end of the story, right. So both of them, they go their own separate ways. So any reference to the couple and any discussion on their characters will be, I believe, incomplete without reference to a game of chess, that is, a game which is conventionally of war, and this game of chess brings in the emotion of love between them. The game of chess, as we all know, I discussed in the first part as well, it's mostly associated with rivalry, with tricks, where one person tricks the other person. And in the game of chess, since time immemorial, the connotations are attached with warfare. But here the game of chess does not embody any feeling of war or enmity. Rather, it becomes a game of love. So the game of chess becomes their private language, right. Let me also now discuss certain aspects about certainly Mary. So she is obviously, as we know, the central character of the entire story. The readers might wonder and why she is referred to as Certainly Mary, and I have discussed it already that it is an unconventional name, Certainly Mary. So the narrator and his sisters has, they have given her the name Certainly Mary because she had this idiosyncratic and characteristic trait of replying everything by adding the suffix certainly, by adding the prefix certainly. So she used to say certainly yes or certainly no, not certainly, yes certainly, so on and so forth. So this word she repeats constantly in her day-to-day conversations, and that is why the author has given her the name Certainly Mary. But unlike her name, she lives uncertainly in England, where she is struggling every day, with the culture and the language. She is not used to the modern escalators of England, as we all know, and almost once fell into the danger of being disrobed completely when her sari got stuck in the elevator. She also speaks a broken sort of an English and does not know how to properly communicate in English, right. So she communicates in faulty English and a broken English. However, this becomes a bridge, it becomes a bridge to get close to his friend Messire, who himself is not able to speak English like a native. So contrary to Certainly Mary's name, she lives with a certain amount of uncertainty in England, you can call it that way. So perhaps one of the things that made her feel at home in England was her relationship with Mixed Up Porter. And then towards the end of section 11, that is the end of the story, the dastardly attack on him and the after receiving exceeding amount of hatred and racist attacks, she was feeling absolutely disillusioned in London, and now she is uncertain about living in England anymore, and therefore she runs away to Bombay, and as soon as she just takes a flight back to Bombay. She believes that going back to Bombay will cure her of her heart ailment, and basically she was feeling homesick, and it did cure her. It certainly did cure her, right. So actually the thing is that the maid Mary, the only thing that is fixed in her mind is, and they are, her Indian roots. That is why when she is no longer able to survive in England, she rushes back to Bombay, right. So the Indian roots, you can say, they remain the starting point of her memory. On the other hand, in the character of Messire, we already know that he is a famous chess player from East Europe, who after his retirement perhaps came to England to live, and here he does a very humble job, a very menial job of a hall porter. And in the character of this man Messire, Mary finds a true companion which will help her feel at ease at a foreign land. And after the attack on him, and after the various vulgar attacks, abuses at the immigrants, she becomes disillusioned, and then she goes to back to her country. So it is interesting to note that the porter himself is not an Indian born man, right. He is an East European, he comes from some East European nation. So this clearly states the fact that for an outsider and an immigrant, getting close to a native person is not that easy. It is not viable, it is not feasible, it seems not possible either. So Mary's association with the porter in the form of the game of chess is described as their private language, and this also gives a new lease of life to Mary, right. So a 60-year-old woman, she is able to learn chess very fast, very perfectly. The game of chess also brings in a certain newness in her world, and she is able to make sense of this foreign land. So they both then after they start meeting, they even both go to the shopping complex and they roam around, and now she is opening up with Mixed Up Porter. So therefore in a way she is able to gain some sort of an identity with her association with Mixed Up Porter. All this comes to an end after the two difficult encounters. First is the racist attack on her and her employer, the mother of the narrator, in the park, and where two Englishmen come and they assault them, they humiliate them, they abuse them and almost sexually assault them, and they abuse them for being immigrants in their country. And the second was the very violent attack by a blade on Mixed Up Porter. So both these incidents, they trouble her, and she felt a strong sense of alienation in a foreign land, and she wants to go back to her country. She is homesick, and she finally goes, right, perhaps never to return to England, right. So the relationship with Messire, certainly Mary's relationship with Messire, her friend, her courter, ends abruptly as she is shocked by the hate received by them in England. She loses all sense and gets desperate to return to India, right. So basically in this section I discussed the relationship between certainly Mary, and I also delivered a sort of a character analysis at a glance of both certainly Mary and Mixed Up Porter. Let me now go on to the next section, and that is Rushdie's sense of in-betweenness and his hybrid self. So when displacement happens, when people move, when people migrate, there can be seen this overlapping of different cultures. So this overlapping of cultures can be seen in the way the young siblings, they sing English, and they sing English songs, and they give references to several English cultural and pop music cultures. Through this, it can be seen that there is an infusion of different cultures. The kids acquire the cultural aspects of English life. The entire family struggles with and adjusts with the cultural demands of England, which is evidently different from their own homeland, isn't it? Right? And this also causes embarrassment to the father in that funny pharmacy episode, right? So similarly, the ayah, certainly Mary's sari, it also got stuck in elevator in London, right? She does not know how to operate and make herself steady in an escalator in 1960s, because in India it was still an invention which did not hold any real grounding, right? So everything is novel to her. So whatever I just now said, there is this idea of overlapping of cultures and intermingling of the West and the East, and the entire story, the quota, is basically an explanation of how the various characters, how they dabble across these two cultures in their own individual capacities, right? This is the hybrid self that I was talking about, the in-betweenness. Except the narrator, I'll come to the in-betweenness in a short while. Everyone in the family, including the ayah, they leave for East as they cannot situate or adjust themselves here. So therefore, the identity is always in question throughout. For this, I'll show you one slide, and that is according to a critic. The name of the critic basically is Titus Pop, and the quota represents the troubles of the migrants and their failure of communication. Yet it celebrates connection across the boundaries of race, nation and language. And the quoter asserts the possibility of an identity that is not single but it is divided, right. So therefore this statement that we just now read is important, because at the end of the story the narrator too says that he will be divided, he will not choose any one space, he will not choose either West or the East. There is not a single identity, but this is a divided identity that the narrator claims. Hence these words by the critic which I just now showed to you are important in understanding one of the key themes of this story. The story captures the essence of the author's hybrid self. This is because this short story is about cross-cultural encounters. It is about cultures from both East and West. The narrator, the siblings, however, they are much more attuned to the Western traditions because they are the new generation. They talk openly about the British culture, they talk about British songs, they talk about the British movies, they talk about pop culture. They understand the British culture and British ways in which the older generations like his father and certainly Mary do not, right. So their repeated reference to the pop culture, to the British songs, to the British culture is emblematic of the fact that for them assimilation in a foreign land is more or less natural. However, for the older generations like Mary and the narrator's father and the narrator's mother and Mixed Up Porter, going back to their Eastern nation perhaps bring them peace. So in the case of Mary, she goes back to Bombay, and in the case of the narrator's family, they go to Pakistan. In the case of mixed up Porter, we do not know where he is, but he has left the place, right? But what strikes the reader of the story is how the narrator himself straddles and dabbles between the East and the West, and in an almost revolting manner, he refuses to choose either the East or the West. So in his consciousness, perhaps he is still confused, perhaps he still is not able to purely associate himself with either the West or the East. Of course, he has faced certain discriminatory remarks for being an Indian boy in England in his school, but still he does not want to go back to India. He knows that life in England will be difficult, but he still chooses to stay there after his family has went back to Karachi, Pakistan, and in an almost revolting manner refuses to pick sides and to choose either the East or the West. And this is the reason why the author Salman Rushdie has placed this story in the third section of which is titled East West in the collection of short stories, right? As we all know, the first section was titled the West, the second section was titled the East, and the third section of this collection of short story was titled East West, right? So therefore the narrator is he makes a conscious decision, and his refusal to accept even one side makes it easy to understand that the story, particularly the quota, demonstrates Rushdie's hybrid self, his in-betweenness. Rushdie has mentioned in several of his interviews that when he went to England, he faced racist encounters, and even a young student in his school actually wrote Vogg's Go Home. He wrote Vogg's Go Home on his chair, right? And then, so basically it's also autobiographical, right? And the Park incident, where the two Britishers come and abuse the Indian women, they also refer to Vogg's, right? So basically it comes across almost as an autobiographical account of the hatred and the racist attacks that Indians faced in Britain. So therefore, it can be safely assumed that majority of the story is in fact a reflective answer, and what you can call a reflective account of what Rushdie also went through while he was living abroad. Rebellious as Salman Rushdie, we all know, rebellious as Salman Rushdie was, his final declaration of the unnamed narrator of not willing to choose any one side. He says that I will not choose either the East or the West. He clearly says that in section 11 of the story. So his final attempt, his final declamation, and his refusal to choose any one side is basically a representative of Rushdie's own views as an expatriate in a foreign country. Rushdie himself refuses to choose either the East or the West, and this is precisely where his idea of hybridization comes forward, and his experiences of not choosing any one particular side creates a bedrock for him basically to develop his theory of in-betweenness, of chutnification, of not aligning to any one particular mode of writing or not aligning to any one particular cultural side, right, or aspects of language. So therefore this is the prime example of the reflexive response of the author Salman Rushdie, whose cultural upbringing and cultural experiences shape his writing experience and his writing techniques also. So therefore, what I am trying to say is that Salman Rushdie wrote in this hybrid manner, which is his own way of negotiating the hybridity which he encountered in his own life as an expatriate living in Britain. The stories therefore take up an overtly autobiographical self. So it is but the genius of an author and his flamboyant narrative style who has taken strength and ideas and you can say narrative techniques from his own life experiences, and he often found himself negotiating between the East and the West. I am talking about the author, and both the unnamed narrator and both Rushdie, this makes sense to both of them. East and West can never be an option for both of them, for any one of them. It seems that Rushdie is suggesting to negotiate between the two cultures and the two belief systems. So he is recommending to negotiate the two ropes, and in this process he is creating what? A hybrid identity, right? So the Eastern and the Western cultural mix, it seems that the Eastern and the Western cultural mix is a mix that Rushdie is employing as a common pathway. This is his idea of in-betweenness, which is most perfectly exemplified in this story, The Quota. Let me now also briefly touch on the idea of in-betweenness in the short story collection titled East West. For that I will look at Terry Eagleton's words on the collection East West, and we will see how it holds true both for Curter as well as the story, the larger collection East West. So Eagleton says that the most important thing about the title East West is, and I am quoting him, he says, the comma. The comma is the most important thing because it can be seen both as a separator and a bridge. This demarcation seems to be an element of playfulness that invites readers not to take the two terms too seriously and as each other's opposite, but to accept them because they exist anyway. Because they exist anyway, this is what he says, right? So therefore, what this means is that the title, the comma, East, comma, West, that's the title. In this title, there is a difference in the cultural makeup of East and West, and he suggests that this difference will always stay there, and therefore, like the narrator himself, like Salman Rushdie himself, it is better not to choose any one, but rather negotiate your way between the two opposing forces of globalization, that is the East and the West. So this is the cultural mix that Rushdie shows again and again in his work, and is best exemplified in the refusal of the narrator to go with any one way, right? So he was being pulled in opposite direction, but he refuses to be pulled either to the west or to the east where his homeland is. He prefers to stay somewhere in between, right? Therefore, it can be said that the quota fits perfectly in the idea of in-betweenness that Homi Bhabha uses, right? Now I will go on to the next topic, and that is Rushdie's experiments with language. So Bhabha gave the term hybridity and Rushdie gave the term chutnification. Chutnification means blending Indian ethos with Western ideas, chutney, right? So we see that in Rushdie's case he uses Hindi words and also Asian words in his book, and for that he does not give any glossary. No glossary is given for the Hindi words, right? So according to him, if we read English without glossary, then British too could do it without glossary. So even the word Hinglish, that is Hinglish, Hinglish, this word also is chutnification, right? There can be many words also in English which cannot be translated into Hindi, and there are several words in Hindi which cannot be translated into English so easily, right? So even the word chutney does not have any real English equivalent. So basically the idea is, by not providing glossary, Rushdie is attempting, in fact, a new he is bringing forward a new cross-cultural movement where he blends and chutnifies Indian culture with Western culture, right? So I will show you a lines by a critic, Anuradha Dinwani, to understand what Rushdie achieves in the story The Curter by using such a language. So as you can see on the screen, quite apart from what Rushdie demonstrated via his technique, his vivid description and his idiosyncratic characters, he showed Indians how the English language could be appropriated, bent in any way one wanted, to achieve sensational effects. These lines by the critic basically, in a way, the way in which Mixed Up Porter and certainly Miri Speak were in fact Rushdie's attempt to showing that the East can appropriate English language in their own ways, and that there is nothing wrong in it. Grammatically they might use incorrect English, but their English is also a means to show their identity. There is in his works a certain exuberance, I would say, in Rushdie's works, and a flamboyance of language which is achieved by the free use of language, which can be achieved only by the free use of irony, wordplay, new literary and narrative techniques, right? So there is a certain playfulness in the story which can be seen in the different ways in which certainly Mary and Mixed Up Porter they speak. The Quoter is also a story of fractured identities and fractured English, right? As these words suggest, and I will show you this story, like virtually all of Rushdie's story, rejects notion of pure origins and authenticity in favor of the impure, the hybrid, the mongrel and the mixed. So hence I said that the story, The Quoter, touches on the idea of fractured English and fractured identities. The fact that their English is also their identities are also fractured is then coterminous with the fact that their English is also fractured, just like their identity, right? So both these ideas are coterminous to each other. So the shifting identity and the characters are named in such a manner which make it difficult to identify their identities, right. I will show you one more critic on the screen. Many of the characters are given nicknames based on pun, similarity of sound, personal characteristics and so on, such as Certainly Mary, Baby Skerezadi, Mixed Up, the Dodo, or they may even have several different names such as Father, Abba or Minotaur, suggesting multiple perspectives and the fact that identity is shifting and can only be defined by the other people's perception within their cultural framework. The text is also interspersed with pop song lyrics, comic strips, westerns, nursery rhymes and Christmas carols, turning the text into what can be termed as a polysemantic narrative, right. So therefore, Rushdie presents us with a totally unconventional sort of a story, where the names, where the narrative structure, where the characters, the storyline is breaking away from normative means of storytelling. It is a unique experience of a narrative style which incorporates within itself groundbreaking techniques, right. So the fractured experiences of identity that the narrator faces in a foreign land is exemplified through a narrative style which seems fractured as well. So the fact that the narrator, the author, has given such unconventional names and description is also a representation of the larger fact that these characters, are basically an extension of the un-English identities of these people. Characters are named in a manner which show that there are certain features in their makeup, in their identity, which define who they are. For example, Certainly Mary is known as Certainly Mary because she keeps repeating these things. Mixed Up Porter is known as Mixed Up Porter because of his, mixed up identities. Sometimes he is known as Messer, sometimes he is known as Mishirish. So all this is mixed up, right. So hence the name Mixed Up Porter. Hence characters are named according to their features, their behaviors, their mannerisms, or how the narrator sees them, right. And Mary also mispronounces Porter as Cotter. She has a speech impairment, she cannot pronounce P, so she just pronounces it as C. So therefore she calls the porter as the Cotter, right. So and he accepts this, and as the narrative goes forward, right. So basically he decides to be a courtier to this old lady. So the idea is that his experiments with language is his way of blending Indian ethos with Western ideas. So Rushdie uses, twists, manipulates and plays along the language to describe what the larger point and the larger theme of the story. So these names in fact become a means of Rushdie, and his way of describing how the identity of people living in England is also mixed up, right. So therefore what this essentially means is that their names become an extension of their identity, right. So Certainly Mary and Mixed Up Porter, these two characters, they are very important to understand these ideas, and the author is using language and is twisting language to show a distorted state of identity, his hybrid self, right, and the confused state in which these people are living in a foreign country. So therefore I will conclude now. The Cutter is a brilliant example of a narrative style which is new, flamboyant, critically acclaimed and boasts of a unique narrative style which is the hallmark of Rushdie's writing style. It ushered in a new set of writing, a novel method of storytelling, a sort of a metafiction where the author directly comments and raises certain important literary techniques which are unconventional and is a fresh break from the stereotypical, from the traditional methods of storytelling. So with this I bring this second lecture to an end, and I thank you all for being with me in these two-part lectures on Salman Rushdie's The Quota. Hopefully I will see you soon in some other lecture at CEC-UGC. I thank you all for your time. Goodbye, good luck.